Hey everybody, how's it going? I hope you're doing okay and your studies are going smoothly. It's time for some more biopsychology revision, and today we're going to be looking at biological rhythms. So this encompasses circadian, infradian and ultradian rhythms, and it encompasses endogenous pacemakers and exogenous Zeitgebers. Let's do this. Here are some exam style questions that I'd encourage you to have a go at. So in a second, if you've got the time and space, do pause the video, give them a go or give some of them a go, and then come back. So here's your chance to pause. Fantastic, okay. Welcome back. Right, so identify, so you don't need to explain anything. The key example of circadian rhythms would be the sleep-wake cycle. Okay, circadian rhythms last 24 hours. Yeah, it literally means around a day, circadian. Okay, so sleep-wake cycle. For question 2, we want to explain infradian rhythms, and we still want to give an example. So, an infradian rhythm is a biological cycle that lasts longer than a day. Yeah, and an example that you've probably learned about is the menstrual cycle, which of course lasts roughly 28 days. Nice and quick so far. Next one, explain the term endogenous pacemaker. Well, an endogenous pacemaker is an internal mechanism that sets your biological rhythms or influences your biological rhythms. We'll come back to this later, but they interact with external factors to produce our rhythms. You might want to throw an example in here. The key one that you should be aware of is the suprachiasmatic nucleus, the SCN. Distinguish, so we're going to do some comparison, similarities and differences here. Distinguish between ultradian and circadian rhythms. Here the difference is time, really, that's it. So ultradian rhythms have a cycle lasting shorter than a day, or they repeat more than once a day, whereas circadian rhythms have a cycle lasting one day, or they repeat once a day. Explain the role of EPs and EZs in the regulation of rhythms. Okay, so endogenous pacemakers are internal mechanisms such as the SCN that coordinate our biological rhythms. Exogenous Zeitgebers are external factors or external cues that can help to reset our rhythms. And to flesh this out and make it clearer for the examiner, I would give an example here. So, for example, in the sleep-wake cycle, the SCN sets our circadian rhythm, but it's reset each day by light, which is an exogenous Zeitgeber. When we see light, that is the cue for our body to stop producing melatonin. Yeah, you could just say that light resets the rhythm. Yeah, so they have to interact to produce our rhythms. That's probably a good word to use. They interact. Okay, explain one strength there's a typo there, research into biological rhythms. Okay, now you don't have to pick a particular study in this question. It could be a more general kind of discussion point of research generally into rhythms or that kind of field. So you might talk about maybe the real world applications. You might say one strength of research into rhythms is the real world application. And you could go one of two ways. We could give a couple of examples here. So you might be aware of something called chronotherapeutics. Chronotherapeutics. So this is the study of how time can affect the mechanism or the effectiveness of therapies. So drugs, for example. So understanding cycles in hormones and in bodily rhythms can help doctors to judge when to deliver therapies. For example, taking aspirin is most effective if you're using it to kind of prevent heart attacks. It's most effective just before bed, so that by the time it actually is at its kind of peak effectiveness and it's thinning the blood, it coordinates or it coincides with when your blood is actually thickest in the early hours of the morning. You could use that, you could ignore that, you could use that in addition to another point, which is that another application is to treating sleep disturbances, so jet lag or shift lag. So we understand from biological rhythm research, that we can use something called phototherapy, so using light treatments to treat things like jet lag and shift lag. So we can shift people's rhythms if they are having disrupted sleep or disrupted circadian rhythms. Yeah. And now, if this is a bigger question, or you want to develop that a bit more, you could talk about, the positive impact on the economy that comes with that. So it could be that, you go down the route of improved healthcare. You could talk about saving money and improving productivity and reducing absence at work, this sort of thing. Yeah, you probably wouldn't need to for 3 marks, but you could. Okay, we want to this time outline a specific study and then briefly evaluate that one. So this is slightly different to the question we've just talked about. Now, probably the most famous study that you'll have looked at is the case study of Michel Siffre, the French cave explorer. So to outline this, it's only 2 marks for this question. I would just talk very briefly about the fact that you don't really need to know his name, it's not a key study, but you could say that a cave explorer spent several months looking at the effect of isolation on rhythms, and he went down into a cave. He was isolated from external cues. He had no daylight, no clocks, no radio, anything like that. So that's kind of the procedure. And then a little bit about the findings. So when he emerged, he thought it was August, I think, and actually it was a few weeks later than that. So effectively he lost several weeks because his rhythm became disrupted, but it did eventually settle to around 25 hours. So there's more there than you need for 2 marks of outlining a study. I'm just giving you an overview. But the second part of this question is to briefly evaluate it. So again, for 2 marks, you just really want to identify and briefly explain either a strength or a limitation. So probably one of the most common criticisms of this study is that it's only one guy. So you could say, once you've done a brief outline, you could say, one limitation of this study is that it is simply a case study of one man. Individual differences are likely to play a role in biological rhythms, and so this study lacks generalizability to the wider population. That'll be fine for 2 marks. You could use a strength. You could talk about that it was controlled because they made sure he had no access to daylight, clocks, that sort of thing. Now, in reality, he did have a lamp, which does confound the study a little bit, but they tried. Okay. 8 marks. Discuss the role of EPs in circadian rhythms. Now, even though it says just endogenous pacemakers, there's no reason you can't bring in exogenous Zeitgebers into the discussion, because you could use their role to kind of undermine the role of endogenous pacemakers, yeah, and kind of talk about how they're not enough on their own and they have to kind of work with exogenous Zeitgebers in order to reset our rhythms each day and keep us kind of working at the same pace as the outside world. But anyway, structurally what you want to do with this is outline what EPs are, talk about the role of the SCN, so that's your knowledge. You could talk about how it works in the sleep-wake cycle. And then you've got 4 or 5 marks, you won't know on the day, but 4 or 5 marks for evaluation and discussion. So here you want to be talking about maybe research support for the role of endogenous pacemakers. So you could actually use the Michel Siffre study, and you could talk about the fact that even though there were no exogenous Zeitgebers, so no external cues, he still eventually settled into a 25-hour rhythm, which does show us that there is an internal mechanism. There is an endogenous pacemaker that sets our rhythms. Yeah, so that's research support for the role of EPs. You might also be aware of the mutant hamster study by Morgan et al. And you could use that one. You could talk about the fact that the mutant hamsters had a rhythm of 20 hours and there was a control group that had a rhythm of 24 hours. They have swapped the SCNs over and they found that their rhythm swapped over. So that shows pretty clearly that the SCN is responsible for circadian rhythms. So again, support for the role of endogenous pacemakers. Yeah, and that's enough for an 8 marker. But as I said, you could introduce some discussion working on exogenous Zeitgebers to show that it's not all about endogenous pacemakers. Okay, for 16 marks, we want to discuss research into biological rhythms. Now, you could go down the route of, picking one study So maybe the cave study, if you know that really well, and then writing maybe 3 or 4 discussion points about that. That would be fine. Or you could maybe split it up a bit and maybe do a couple of studies and maybe have a more general paragraph towards the end, like when we talked about the real-world applications. So it's up to you. Depends how confident you are, how much you know about any one study, but it is quite an open question, this one. Yeah. So, in terms of evaluation points, going back to Sifra's study, I mentioned that it is controlled, but the development, the discussion could be, however, he had access to artificial light. He had a lamp down there, for obvious reasons. It's a bit harsh to expect him to spend 6 months in the dark completely. But the issue is we understand from later research that artificial light can shift our rhythms as well. So while he's got that light on, he's kind of stimulating his biological rhythms to stay awake. So there is a bit of an issue with, is it purely about the SCN, or has that maybe become a confounding or extraneous variable and undermine the internal validity? So you could have a discussion about that. You could discuss the generalizability of these isolation studies. They're all case studies, really. There's one on infradian rhythms by, I think, the researcher was called Reinberg. There's one where they did, infradian rhythms. They had a woman in a cave, and they were using her menstrual cycles as the indicator of rhythms. So you could talk about that, but again, it's only a case study of one person. There's one where they had, I think her name was Kate. I can't remember her second name, but she was in a sleep lab, and she had to play Amazing Grace on the bagpipes. It's quite memorable, at the same time every day, or what she thought was the same time. And they kind of used that to track her circadian rhythms. Again, it's an individual kind of study, because as soon as we've got other people, that can act as another cue that could tell you, is it bedtime, how long has it been, all this sort of thing, confounding the study. So there's a reason they use individual kind of cases, as it were, but it does lead to an issue with generalizability and individual differences. So you could talk about that research. If you're going to discuss individual differences, you could talk about more recent genetic research that has looked at different kind of variations in rhythms that can be inherited. So you might have heard of DISPs or FASPs. So FASPs is familial advanced sleep phase syndrome, I think it stands for. But basically, you can inherit being what we call an owl or a lark. So preferring to be, a morning person or a night owl, as it were. So there are individual differences in rhythms, and some of this is genetically determined. But if you talk about individual differences, you could talk about how a lot of the research lacks generalizability. Okay, I think that's plenty to be getting on with. Okay, so reflection. How did it go? What do you need to do next? How is this going to feed back into future actions and into your future revision? I hope that was useful, guys. Do feel free to drop a question or comment down below. Keep going. You can do it. Bish bash bosh.